hospital.
Leave him alone.
I'll be the judge of that.
Oh shit.
Stop real fast. His machete.
Machete begins like a movie that has no interest in playing by the rules, immediately throwing the audience into a world of violence, betrayal, corruption, and larger-than-life action, and from the opening moments it becomes clear that Machete Cortez is not an ordinary hero. Because he is a former Mexican Federal officer whose reputation is built on years of combat experience, brutal efficiency, and an almost legendary ability to survive situations that would destroy an ordinary man. But before the audience fully understands who Machete is, the movie places him directly in danger, surrounded by heavily armed criminals and corrupt figures who believe they have complete control over the situation. And this opening establishes one of the most important ideas of the entire film. Machete may be underestimated, but he is extremely dangerous when pushed too far. And what makes the character particularly interesting is that he is not presented as a clean-cut traditional action hero, because Danny Trejo's appearance, physical presence, and quiet personality make him look like someone who has spent his entire life fighting rather than someone who wants to be admired. And instead of giving long speeches about justice, Machete usually lets his actions speak for him. And this makes him different from many modern action protagonists, because his personality is built around silence, toughness, and survival. And as the opening sequence develops, the audience quickly discovers that Machete has been hired to carry out a dangerous mission against a powerful target. But the job is not what it appears to be, because the people who hired him have their own hidden agenda. And this deception becomes the foundation of the story, and Machete soon finds himself trapped in a situation where he has been betrayed by the very people who promised him the job. And rather than simply accepting his fate, he fights his way out with the kind of brutal creativity that becomes one of the movie's trademarks, using knives, firearms, improvised weapons, and his physical strength to survive. And the opening action is deliberately exaggerated, because Machete is not trying to present itself as a realistic crime thriller. It is designed as an exploitation-style action movie, inspired by the grindhouse films of the 1970s and 1980s, and director Robert Rodriguez embraces that style completely, filling the movie with exaggerated violence, outrageous characters, dark humor, political satire, and deliberately over-the-top action. And the result is a movie that feels like a modern recreation of an old school revenge thriller, while also functioning as a parody of the genre. And Danny Trejo is perfectly suited to the role because Machete had already appeared as a recurring character in Rodriguez's Spy Kids films, where the character was presented as a strange but memorable Mexican action figure. But Machete transforms that character into the center of a much darker and more violent story. And this change in tone is immediately obvious, because the family-friendly version of Machete is replaced by a hardened man with a tragic history and a deep hatred of the people who destroyed his life. And as the story moves forward, the audience begins learning more about Machete's past. And this background is essential to understanding why he behaves the way he does. Because he was once a respected federal officer in Mexico, a man who believed in his work and understood the responsibility that came with protecting people. But his world was destroyed when powerful criminals and corrupt officials became involved in his life. And one of the most important figures from his past is Torres, a ruthless drug lord played by Steven Seagal, whose presence represents the criminal world that Machete has spent years fighting. And Torres is not simply another gangster, because he is presented as a powerful figure with enormous influence, wealth, and a willingness to kill anyone who stands in his way. And the history between Machete and Torres is personal, because Machete has already suffered because of this man and understands exactly how dangerous he is. And this creates a revenge element that runs beneath the entire story. And although Machete's immediate circumstances may change, his larger goal remains connected to confronting the people responsible for the destruction of his life. And the movie slowly introduces the different players who will become important as the story develops, including Senator John McLaughlin, played by Robert De Niro, who is running for political office while using anti-immigrant rhetoric to build support. And this character introduces the political side of the movie, because Machete is not simply interested in action. It is also using its story to satirize American immigration politics, border violence, racism, political corruption, and the way powerful people can manipulate public fear for personal advantage. And Senator McLaughlin is particularly important because he understands how to turn public anxiety into political power, presenting himself as a strong leader who will protect the country from illegal immigration, while behind the scenes, the situation is far more complicated. And the movie deliberately exaggerates this political environment to make its point, creating a world where politicians, businessmen, criminals, and corrupt officials are all connected through money and power. And Machete becomes an outsider moving through this system, someone who has little interest in political speeches and simply wants to survive and protect the people who matter to him. And another major character is Michael Booth, played by Jeff Fahey, a wealthy businessman and political operator who appears to be supporting Senator McLaughlin. But his motivations are much more complicated than they initially appear. And Booth becomes one of the people responsible for bringing Machete into the assassination plot, because he believes Machete can be used as a disposable weapon, someone who can carry out a dangerous act and then be blamed for it. And this is where the movie's central conspiracy begins to take shape. Because Machete is hired to assassinate McLaughlin, but the assignment is actually designed to make it look as though a Mexican immigrant committed the killing, allowing the political establishment to use the assassination as propaganda and strengthen its anti-immigration message. And this plan reveals the movie's central criticism of political manipulation, because the powerful characters are willing to create violence in order to control public opinion. and Machete is simply another piece on their chessboard. But they make a major mistake by assuming that he will die quietly once the mission is complete, because Machete survives the assassination attempt. And once he realizes that he has been betrayed, he becomes a threat to everyone involved. And this transformation is one of the most important moments in the movie, because Machete stops being a pawn and becomes an unpredictable force moving against the people who try to use him. And his survival creates a serious problem for Booth and the others, because Machete knows that the assassination attempt was a setup, and if he can expose the conspiracy, the political plan could collapse. So the people behind the operation begin trying to eliminate him, and this sends Machete into a world where almost everyone around him has an agenda, and he cannot trust politicians, criminals, or businessmen, forcing him to rely on the few people he believes are genuinely loyal. And one of those people is Luz, played by Michelle Rodriguez, a strong and independent character connected to the immigrant community and the underground resistance against corrupt authorities. And Luz is not simply a romantic interest, because she has her own goals, her own influence, and her own willingness to fight. And her character becomes an important bridge between Machete and the people being targeted by the political system. And Michelle Rodriguez brings the role the kind of physical confidence that fits naturally into the movie's world, because Luz is capable of handling herself in dangerous situations and refuses to be treated as helpless. And another important character is Sartana Rivera, played by Jessica Alba, an immigration officer who initially appears to represent the law but gradually becomes aware that the system around her is deeply corrupt. And her character provides another perspective on the central conflict because she is caught between her official responsibilities and her growing understanding that the people in power are manipulating the situation. And Sartana's investigation eventually brings her closer to Machete and the conspiracy. And this creates an uneasy alliance between characters who would normally be on opposite sides. And this is one of the movie's recurring ideas, because the people who are supposed to represent justice are often compromised, while people considered criminals or outsiders may actually be fighting against corruption. And Machete's journey, therefore, becomes larger than personal revenge, because he gradually becomes connected to a broader struggle involving immigrants, political activists, law enforcement, and criminals. And the movie intentionally blurs the traditional boundaries between heroes and villains. And this is part of what makes the film different from a straightforward action movie, because almost every major character has a hidden motivation, and the audience is constantly encouraged to question who can be trusted. And as Machete begins investigating the people who betrayed him, he discovers that the assassination attempt is connected to a much larger conspiracy involving Senator McLaughlin and powerful people who want to create a climate of fear. And the more he learns, the more dangerous the situation becomes, because the people behind the conspiracy have money, weapons, political influence, and connections throughout the system, while Machete has little more than his skills and determination. But that is exactly what makes him dangerous, because he is not trying to compete with them politically or financially. He is attacking the system from the outside, and his weapon of choice is often the machete itself, which becomes an extension of his identity. And the movie treats the machete almost like a legendary weapon, turning an ordinary blade into a symbol of Machete's character, because he uses it with incredible speed and precision. And the exaggerated action surrounding the weapon is part of the film's dark humor, because the audience is meant to recognize that these scenes are intentionally excessive. And this is where Rodriguez's filmmaking style becomes especially important, because Machete is built around the concept of taking exploitation cinema to an extreme, and the movie does not attempt to hide its influences. Instead, it celebrates them, using grainy visual touches, violent set pieces, exaggerated dialogue, outrageous villains, and deliberately sensational scenes. And the title itself tells the audience exactly what kind of movie they are watching, because Machete is not interested in subtlety, and the character is introduced as a larger than life figure whose reputation is almost mythical. And Danny Trejo's performance works because he does not overplay the character with constant jokes. Instead, he maintains a serious expression while the world around him becomes increasingly ridiculous. And that contrast creates much of the movie's humor, because Machete behaves as though everything is completely serious, even when the situations become absurd. And this allows the film to combine comedy and violence without losing its action identity. And as Machete's situation becomes more dangerous, the people who betrayed him begin sending more enemies after him. But each attempt to eliminate him only makes him more determined. And this begins creating the structure of a classic revenge story, where the hero starts at the bottom and gradually works his way toward the people responsible for his suffering. But the movie adds its own political and social dimension to that formula, because Machete's enemies are not simply random criminals, they are connected to systems of power that exploit vulnerable communities. And this makes his revenge symbolic as well as personal. And as the conspiracy develops, the audience begins to understand that Senator McLaughlin's campaign is built around creating fear of immigrants, and the assassination plot is intended to reinforce that fear. Because if McLaughlin can present himself as the victim of a violent immigrant, he can justify stronger border policies and increase his political support. And the movie presents this plan as an example of how fear can be manufactured. And this is one of the most serious themes beneath its outrageous surface, because the film is using extreme satire to criticize real political arguments and the manipulation of public opinion. And Machete becomes an unexpected threat to this strategy, because his survival could expose the entire operation. And this means that the powerful people involved have no choice but to pursue him aggressively. And Machete, meanwhile, begins building his own network of allies, because he understands that fighting an entire system alone would be impossible. And this brings him closer to Luz and other people who have reasons to oppose the corrupt authorities. And the idea of a resistance movement gradually becomes more important, because the conflict is no longer just Machete against one enemy. It is becoming a larger battle between people who are being exploited and those who profit from that exploitation. And the movie uses this expanding conflict to introduce more action, more characters, and more opportunities for Machete to demonstrate his abilities. And as the story progresses, the audience learns that Machete is not simply a skilled fighter. He is also highly experienced at reading dangerous situations, understanding criminal behavior, and surviving when the odds are against him. And this background helps explain why he is so difficult to kill, because he has spent years operating in environments where betrayal and violence were normal. And he knows that trusting the wrong person can be fatal. And his quiet nature also helps him because enemies often underestimate him, assuming that his silence means weakness, when in reality he is observing everything around him. And when the moment comes to act, he moves with extraordinary speed. And this becomes one of the film's recurring patterns, where enemies think they have control before Machete suddenly turns the situation against them. And this creates a sense of anticipation because the audience begins to expect that Machete will find a way out even when the situation looks impossible. But the movie also gives him emotional weaknesses, particularly his memories of his past and the people he has lost. And these memories prevent him from becoming a completely emotionless killing machine. Because underneath his violent exterior, there is still a man who has experienced betrayal, grief, and loss, and this emotional history gives his revenge motivation. And as he moves deeper into the conspiracy, he begins confronting people connected to his past. And each confrontation reminds him of how much has been taken from him, and this makes his mission increasingly personal. But he also begins recognizing that his struggle is connected to the struggles of other people, and this broadens his motivation because he is no longer fighting only for himself. He is fighting against a system that has harmed many others. And the movie uses Machete's journey to explore the idea of an outsider becoming a symbol, because the people around him begin seeing him as someone who can fight back against those who have controlled them. And this gives the character a legendary quality, and the title Machete therefore represents more than the man himself. It represents resistance, anger, and the refusal to accept oppression. And the film constantly reinforces this symbolism through its imagery, dialogue, and action. And as Machete prepares for the next stage of his fight, the conspiracy around Senator McLaughlin becomes increasingly complicated, because there are multiple people involved, each with different goals, and some characters are working for money, others for political power, and others simply because they enjoy violence. And this mixture makes the enemy unpredictable. And Machete must therefore navigate a world where alliances can change quickly, and the movie uses this uncertainty to keep the audience guessing. Because even when Machete appears to have found someone who can help him, there is always the possibility that the person has another agenda. And this is particularly important in the political storyline because Senator McLaughlin's public image is completely different from the reality behind his campaign. And the movie deliberately contrasts his polished political presentation with the violent conspiracy taking place behind the scenes. And Robert De Niro's performance plays into this contrast because McLaughlin can appear confident and authoritative in public while being surrounded by people who are willing to manipulate and kill to protect his political future. And this creates a darkly comic picture of power, because the people presenting themselves as protectors are secretly helping create the very violence they claim to oppose. And Machete's presence threatens to expose that contradiction, and this is why he becomes such a dangerous enemy to them, because he cannot be easily controlled, and he has no reason to cooperate with the system that betrayed him. And as the first major phase of the story approaches its conclusion, Machete is forced to make a decision about how he will respond to the people who tried to kill him. And rather than disappearing or running away, he chooses to fight back. And this decision sets the direction for the rest of the movie, because from this point forward, Machete is no longer simply trying to survive. He is actively hunting the people responsible. And this transforms the story from a survival thriller into a revenge-driven action saga. And the movie begins preparing the audience for increasingly intense confrontations, because Machete's enemies have underestimated him for too long. And now they are going to discover exactly why his name has become feared. And the first part of his journey therefore establishes the essential pieces of the story: a former federal officer with a violent past, a powerful drug lord connected to his history, a corrupt political conspiracy, an assassination plot designed to manipulate public fear, a group of allies fighting against the system, and a hero who refuses to remain a victim. And all of these elements come together to create the central conflict, because Machete must survive long enough to expose the people behind the conspiracy while confronting the enemies who destroyed his previous life. And the more he learns, the more dangerous his mission becomes. But he is no longer interested in turning back because he has already lost too much to allow the people responsible to continue controlling the situation. And as the story moves toward its next phase, Machete begins preparing for a much larger battle, one that will involve criminals, corrupt politicians, law enforcement, and the people living on both sides of the border. and the audience is left with the clear understanding that the conspiracy is only beginning to reveal itself, and Machete's greatest challenge will not simply be defeating one enemy, but surviving a system designed to destroy anyone who threatens the people in power. And with his machete in hand and his enemies closing in, Machete prepares to turn the tables, because the man they believed they could use as a disposable weapon is now coming after them. And from this point forward, nobody involved in the conspiracy will be safe.
After surviving the assassination setup, Machete Cortez is no longer simply a man trying to stay alive. He has become a dangerous loose end for everyone involved in the conspiracy, because the people who hired him believed they could use him, frame him, and then eliminate him before anyone discovered the truth. But they made the mistake of underestimating the one person in the entire operation who understands violence better than almost anyone else. And now, Machete begins moving through the shadows, trying to understand exactly who betrayed him and why, while the people behind the conspiracy desperately attempt to control the story before Machete can expose them. And this is where Machete begins expanding from a simple revenge story into a much larger political and criminal conflict. Because the assassination attempt against Senator John McLaughlin was never really about killing a politician. It was about creating a political event that could be used to manipulate public fear. And Machete's survival threatens to destroy that plan. So the conspirators begin searching for him while simultaneously preparing a public narrative that will make them appear innocent. And this contrast between public image and hidden reality becomes one of the film's most important themes. Because the people in power are constantly presenting themselves as defenders of society, while secretly creating the violence they claim to be fighting. And Senator McLaughlin becomes the face of this contradiction because he is using anti immigration politics to gain support, presenting immigrants as a threat while people around him are involved in criminal activities that are far more dangerous than anything he claims to be protecting the public from. And Machete's existence threatens to expose this hypocrisy because he is living proof that the assassination was not what it appeared to be. And this is why the people behind the plan become increasingly desperate to find him. But Machete has already learned one of the most important lessons of his life. When powerful people decide that you are disposable, you cannot expect them to stop hunting you. So the only option is to fight back. And this attitude becomes the driving force behind the next stage of his journey. And while Machete is trying to uncover the truth, Sartana Rivera is also becoming increasingly suspicious of the official story because she is an immigration officer who has seen the border situation from a different perspective. And although she initially operates within the system, she begins to recognize that something is deeply wrong with the people controlling the investigation, and her growing doubts place her in danger because the corrupt figures behind the conspiracy cannot allow anyone with access to information to start asking the wrong questions. And Sartana's position gives her access to records, evidence, and information that ordinary people cannot obtain, making her a potential threat to the conspiracy. And this gradually brings her into Machete's orbit, even though the two initially come from very different worlds, because Machete is a former federal officer who has lost faith in powerful institutions, while Sartana is still trying to understand how deeply corruption has reached into the system she serves. And their relationship becomes important because it represents two different reactions to institutional corruption. Machete has already learned that the system can betray him, while Sartana is only beginning to discover that lesson. And as she investigates further, the line between law enforcement and criminal activity becomes increasingly unclear because some of the people supposedly protecting the public are working for powerful interests, and some of the people labeled as criminals are actually fighting against those same interests. And this moral confusion is exactly what Robert Rodriguez wants the audience to notice. Because Machete is deliberately constructed as an exaggerated political satire, and every extreme character represents some aspect of the social and political environment the film is criticizing. And the movie's style makes this criticism easier to digest because instead of delivering a conventional political lecture, Rodriguez turns the subject into a violent exploitation thriller filled with absurd situations, outrageous characters, and dark comedy. And this allows the film to make serious points while still remaining entertaining. And Machete himself becomes the perfect vehicle for that approach because he is a character who communicates more through action than words, and his presence alone challenges the stereotypes being created by the political establishment. Because the people who want to portray Mexican immigrants as helpless victims or dangerous criminals cannot easily understand a man like Machete, who is capable, experienced, independent, and completely unwilling to accept their version of reality. And his strength, therefore, becomes symbolic because he represents someone who refuses to be defined by the people in power. And as the conspiracy continues, Machete begins reconnecting with people from his past. And this allows the movie to reveal more about the man he once was. Because before becoming a feared warrior, Machete had been a federal officer who believed in justice. And his previous life explains why betrayal affects him so deeply. Because he once trusted institutions and people who ultimately failed him. And his transformation into a lone survivor is therefore not simply the result of being naturally violent, it is the result of repeated loss and betrayal. And this history also explains his connection to Torres, the drug lord played by Steven Seagal. Because Taurus represents one of the darkest chapters of Machete's past, and their conflict is more than a simple hero versus villain relationship. Because Torres is connected to the events that destroyed Machete's life, and Machete knows that confronting him will eventually become unavoidable. And this gives the movie a second layer of revenge that operates alongside the political conspiracy. Because Machete is fighting both the people who betrayed him in the present and the criminals who caused his suffering in the past. And these two conflicts gradually begin moving toward the same destination. And as Machete gathers information, he realizes that the people involved are far more connected than he originally believed. Because criminal organizations, political operators, and wealthy businessmen are all working together when their interests overlap. And Michael Booth becomes one of the most important figures in this network because he is not simply a businessman supporting a political campaign. He is someone who understands how to manipulate people and events. And he believes that Machete can be used as a tool to create a political crisis. But once Machete survives, Booth must find another way to control the situation. And this leads him to use other criminals and corrupt officials against Machete. But each attempt becomes increasingly difficult because Machete has experience surviving exactly this kind of violence. And he knows how criminals think, how they move, and how they react when they are frightened. and this allows him to turn their own aggression against them. And one of the defining characteristics of Machete is that he does not fight in the polished style of a conventional action hero. Instead, he uses whatever is available, including knives, guns, vehicles, and the environment around him. And this improvisational style makes him unpredictable because his enemies cannot easily anticipate what he will do next. And the movie turns this into a source of both excitement and humor because Machete often performs impossible looking acts with a completely serious expression. And Danny Trejo's deadpan performance makes these moments even more entertaining because he never seems surprised by the absurdity of the world around him. And this creates the unique tone of the film, where extreme violence and dark comedy exist side by side. And while Machete is fighting his enemies, Luz is becoming more important to the larger resistance because she represents the people who are directly affected by the political policies being promoted by McLaughlin and his supporters. And her role expands the story beyond Machete's personal revenge because the conflict is becoming about an entire community fighting against people who want to control them through fear. And Luz's character is strong because she is not waiting for someone to rescue her. She is already involved in the struggle. And Machete's arrival gives that resistance a powerful new weapon. But it also increases the danger because once the authorities realize that Machete is working with people who oppose the political establishment, they begin treating the entire group as a threat. And this creates a larger conflict in which law enforcement, criminals, politicians, and activists all collide, and Sartana finds herself increasingly caught between her official duties and the truth she is discovering. And this creates an internal conflict for her because she has spent her career believing that the system can provide justice. But now, she is seeing evidence that powerful people are manipulating that system for their own benefit. And her relationship with Machete gradually changes because she begins to understand that the man she may have once considered a dangerous criminal is actually fighting against a much larger form of corruption. And this realization becomes one of the turning points in the story because Machete begins gaining allies who can help him expose the conspiracy, while the conspirators become increasingly isolated. And this is exactly what Booth and McLaughlin fear, because their political strategy depends on controlling the narrative. And if the public learns that the assassination attempt was manufactured, their entire campaign could collapse. So they need Machete dead before he can reveal the truth. And the hunt for him intensifies, with assassins, corrupt officers, and criminals all attempting to locate him. But Machete continues moving through the city and border regions, gathering information and eliminating threats, and every confrontation reveals another piece of the larger puzzle. And this structure allows the movie to introduce its supporting characters gradually while maintaining the momentum of the action. And one of the most interesting aspects of Machete is how it deliberately exaggerates the traditional stereotypes of action cinema. Because villains are extremely cruel, politicians are extremely corrupt, heroes are extremely tough, and almost every situation is more outrageous than the previous one. But beneath those exaggerations is a serious criticism of how political fear can be manufactured. And the film's treatment of immigration is central to this criticism. Because Senator McLaughlin's campaign depends on convincing voters that immigrants are responsible for social problems. While the movie shows that the real threat often comes from the people exploiting those fears for power. And Machete's existence challenges the politician's narrative because he is both a Mexican immigrant figure and an extraordinarily capable fighter, making it impossible to reduce him to the stereotype being promoted by the political campaign. And this is why the character becomes symbolic, because the people in power want to define him, but he refuses to accept their definition. And his response is not through political speeches, but through action. And as the conspiracy becomes more complicated, Machete's personal connection to Torres becomes increasingly important because the drug lord represents a threat that cannot be ignored. And Machete knows that eventually he will have to confront the man who has been part of his nightmare for years. And Torres, meanwhile, continues operating with confidence because he believes his power makes him untouchable. But he does not fully understand the danger represented by Machete. And this creates a classic confrontation between a powerful villain and a man who has nothing left to lose. And Machete's lack of fear becomes one of his greatest weapons because the people trying to control him often rely on threats, money, or promises, but none of those things have much influence over a man who has already lost so much. And this makes him extremely difficult to manipulate. And the more pressure the conspirators apply, the more determined he becomes. And as the story moves toward its middle section, Machete begins actively targeting the network of people responsible for the assassination setup. And this creates a series of violent encounters that gradually weaken the conspiracy. And each victory gives him more information, but it also increases the attention he receives. And the people at the top begin realizing that they are no longer dealing with an isolated survivor. They are dealing with someone who is actively dismantling their operation. And this is where Michael Booth's confidence begins to weaken. Because he initially believed that Machete was simply a disposable asset. But now he sees that Machete is becoming the biggest threat to everything Booth has built. And Booth responds by escalating the violence, sending more powerful enemies after him. And this escalation creates some of the movie's most memorable action sequences because Machete is forced to fight larger groups of enemies while protecting the people who have joined him. And the movie uses these confrontations to showcase Rodriguez's signature action style, combining practical looking violence with exaggerated choreography, fast pacing, and dark humor. And the action is often intentionally unrealistic, but that is part of the film's identity because Machete is designed to feel like a comic book brought to life where characters can survive impossible situations and ordinary objects can become deadly weapons. And Machete's machete becomes especially important because it represents his old identity as a warrior and his refusal to surrender. And the weapon also gives the movie a visual symbol that audiences can immediately associate with the character. And whenever Machete draws it, the audience knows that the situation is about to become much more dangerous. And Danny Trejo's physical presence makes these moments effective because he does not need elaborate dialogue to establish his authority. His face and body language communicate everything. And this is one reason Trejo was such a natural choice for the role, because he had spent decades appearing in tough guy and villain roles, and Rodriguez understood that audiences would immediately believe him as someone capable of surviving a brutal world. But Machete gives Trejo something different from many of his previous roles by allowing him to become the central hero. And this casting decision is significant because the character is finally being given the opportunity to lead the kind of action movie he had often been part of from the supporting side. And the movie embraces that idea completely, making Machete the center of the story and allowing his quiet intensity to carry the film. And as Machete's allies continue helping him, the conspiracy begins to fracture. But the enemy still has one major advantage: political power, and Senator McLaughlin remains capable of influencing public opinion. And this means that even if Machete defeats individual criminals, he still has to confront the larger system that allowed the conspiracy to exist. And this is where the story's political satire becomes increasingly important. Because Machete is fighting not only people with guns, but also people with influence. And the movie suggests that corruption becomes most dangerous when criminal behavior and political power work together. Because the criminals can use the system for protection, while politicians can use criminals to accomplish things they cannot openly do themselves. And this creates a cycle in which both sides benefit while ordinary people suffer. And Machete's role is to break that cycle. And the fact that he is an outsider makes him especially dangerous because he does not belong to either side of the established system. And he cannot be easily bought or intimidated. And this is why his survival becomes a serious political problem. And as the movie approaches its next major turning point, Machete realizes that the only way to defeat the conspiracy is to expose the people behind it, while also confronting the criminal forces supporting them. And this means that his personal revenge and the larger political struggle are finally becoming one mission. And Luz and Sartana become increasingly important allies in this battle because they each bring something different. Luz understands the underground resistance and the people affected by the political conflict, while Sartana has knowledge of law enforcement and access to information. And together with Machete, they create an alliance that the conspirators never expected. And this alliance also changes Machete emotionally because, for perhaps the first time in a long time, he is no longer fighting completely alone. And although he remains quiet and independent, he begins trusting people again. And this is significant because betrayal had taught him to avoid emotional connections. But the new relationships force him to recognize that not everyone will betray him. And this gives the character another dimension beyond violence and revenge. And as the danger increases, Machete becomes increasingly determined to protect the people who have chosen to stand beside him. And this makes the stakes more personal because now he has more to lose than simply his own life. And the conspirators recognize this and attempt to use his relationships against him. But this only strengthens his determination, and the story therefore begins moving toward a much larger confrontation, one involving the political campaign, the criminal organization, the resistance movement, and Machete himself. And the tension increases because everyone is preparing for a different kind of battle. With the politicians preparing their public narrative, the criminals preparing their weapons, the resistance preparing to fight back, and Machete preparing to confront the people responsible for the betrayal. and the audience can feel that the separate storylines are slowly moving toward the same point. And this is where the film begins transitioning from investigation into open conflict. Because Machete is no longer hiding from his enemies, he is preparing to confront them directly. And the people who once believed they controlled him are beginning to realize that they created a problem they cannot easily solve. Because they took a highly trained former federal officer, betrayed him, tried to kill him, and then expected him to disappear. But instead, they created their own greatest enemy. And Machete now has every reason to fight until the entire conspiracy is destroyed. And as the story moves forward, the audience understands that the next stage will be far more violent and dangerous than anything Machete has faced so far. Because the people at the top are beginning to panic, and desperate people with money and political power can become more dangerous than ordinary criminals. And Machete is going to have to face all of them, while also confronting the ghosts of his past and the enemies who have been waiting for him for years. And the second part therefore ends with Machete standing at the center of a conflict that has grown far beyond the original assassination plot. Because what began as a simple setup has now become a battle involving corruption, immigration politics, organized crime, revenge, and resistance, and Machete is finally ready to stop running. Because the people who tried to use him have given him only one option: fight back. And with his allies beginning to gather around him and his enemies preparing for war, Machete's real mission is only beginning. And the next stage will force him to confront the people who believe they control the entire system, proving that the man they considered disposable may be the one person capable of bringing their entire operation down. Machete's fight now becomes much bigger than the personal revenge mission that first brought him into the conspiracy. Because the deeper he goes, the more clearly he sees that the people responsible for trying to kill him are connected to a larger network of political corruption, organized crime, illegal weapons, and manipulation of public fear. And this discovery changes the nature of his mission because he can no longer simply find one person and settle an old score. He has to survive long enough to expose an entire system that has been designed to protect powerful people while leaving ordinary communities vulnerable. And the most dangerous part is that the people controlling this system do not think of themselves as criminals. They believe their wealth, political influence, and connections make them untouchable. And this confidence becomes one of their greatest weaknesses because they have become so accustomed to controlling everyone around them that they cannot imagine someone like Machete refusing to play by their rules. And Machete is exactly the kind of enemy they are not prepared to face because he does not want money, he does not want political office, and he does not care about social status. He wants justice for the people who have been hurt and revenge against the people who betrayed him. And this makes him almost impossible to manipulate. And as Machete continues his investigation, he begins moving closer to the people behind the assassination plot, while Sartana Rivera is also becoming more determined to understand what is really happening. And her position as an immigration officer places her in a unique situation because she has access to information that can expose the movement of people and money across the border. But the more she learns, the more dangerous her position becomes because corruption is not limited to one office or one criminal organization. It reaches into different parts of the system. and the people protecting the conspiracy know that someone like Sartana could become a serious threat if she starts connecting the evidence. And this creates a growing sense of paranoia around her because she cannot easily know which people inside the system can be trusted. And Machete understands this problem better than anyone because his own history has taught him that corruption often hides behind official authority. And this is why he remains cautious even when working with people who claim to be helping him. And his distrust is not simply cynicism, it is survival instinct because every mistake can cost a life and every piece of information could be a trap. And as the story develops, Luz becomes increasingly important to the resistance against the political establishment, and her character helps show that the conflict is affecting ordinary people far beyond Machete himself. Because the political campaign against immigrants has created fear throughout the community, and people are being treated as enemies simply because of where they come from. And Luz refuses to accept that treatment, becoming a symbol of resistance and organization. And Machete's connection with her gives him access to people who are already fighting back. And this is important because Machete cannot defeat the entire system alone, even with his extraordinary combat abilities. And the movie begins showing that the resistance is strongest when people work together, with each person contributing something different to the struggle. And this idea of collective resistance becomes one of the most important themes in the film because the powerful characters believe that ordinary people can be controlled through fear. But the movie suggests that fear becomes less effective when people recognize that they are not alone. And Machete becomes a rallying figure because his survival proves that the powerful can be challenged. And as his reputation spreads, his enemies become increasingly nervous because every failure to eliminate him makes him more difficult to control. And Michael Booth is particularly concerned because his original plan has now completely collapsed, and the man he believed would become a disposable assassin has instead become a dangerous witness who knows too much. And Booth's response is to increase the pressure, using money, influence, and hired killers to try to eliminate Machete. But these attempts repeatedly fail because Machete is not fighting according to predictable rules, and he uses his surroundings, his experience, and his knowledge of criminal behavior to survive. And the movie continues presenting him as a character who can turn almost anything into a weapon, which allows the action sequences to become increasingly creative and exaggerated. And this is where the film's exploitation style becomes particularly visible. Because Rodriguez is not interested in realistic combat choreography as much as he is interested in creating memorable moments that feel like they came from a violent comic book or an old grindhouse movie. And Machete's Machete becomes a visual symbol of that style because whenever he draws the blade, the audience knows that the situation is about to become extreme. And Danny Trejo's deadpan expression makes the violence feel even more absurd because he treats every impossible situation as though it is simply another day at work. And this creates the film's unusual mixture of brutality and humor. And while Machete is becoming more dangerous, Senator McLaughlin continues building his public campaign, presenting himself as a strong political figure who promises to protect Americans from immigrants. And the movie deliberately portrays his speeches as part of a larger performance because behind the public image is a network of people who are willing to create violence to strengthen his position. And this is the central political satire of the story. Because McLaughlin's political strategy depends on fear, and the assassination attempt was designed to give that fear a face, allowing him to point to an alleged immigrant attacker and tell voters that his warnings were correct. But Machete's survival threatens the entire narrative because the truth is that the attack was engineered by people connected to the political establishment. And this contradiction becomes increasingly dangerous as evidence begins to surface. And Sartana's investigation becomes more important because she begins recognizing that the official explanation does not match what she has seen, and her growing suspicion puts her on a collision course with the people behind the conspiracy. And this is one of the reasons her relationship with Machete becomes stronger. Because both characters have different experiences but are arriving at the same conclusion. The system they trusted has been compromised, and they cannot simply follow orders anymore. And Machete's approach is direct and violent, while Satana's approach is investigative and analytical. But their goals begin to overlap, and together they represent two different forms of resistance. And the movie uses this relationship to show that defeating corruption requires more than physical strength, because information, evidence, and public awareness are also weapons. And as Machete and his allies gather more information, they begin understanding that the assassination plot is connected to a larger strategy involving the border, political fear, and criminal organizations. And the people behind the conspiracy are not acting randomly. They are creating chaos because chaos allows them to gain more control. And this is what makes the political side of the story more dangerous than the ordinary criminal violence. Because criminals may want money or territory, but political conspirators can manipulate entire populations. And Machete realizes that stopping one assassin or one gangster will not be enough. He must break the chain connecting them. And this realization pushes him toward a larger confrontation. And meanwhile, Torres remains an important threat in the background because Machete knows that their past conflict has not been forgotten, and Torres is powerful enough to create serious problems for anyone who gets in his way. And Steven Seagal's portrayal of Torres gives the character a calm and threatening presence because he does not need to constantly shout or demonstrate his power. His reputation does most of the work, and his history with Machete makes their eventual confrontation feel inevitable because both men understand that the conflict between them cannot remain unresolved forever. And Machete's journey toward the political conspiracy, therefore, also becomes a journey back toward the criminal world he once escaped. And this creates an interesting contrast because he is trying to fight the very environment that shaped him. And as the pressure increases, Machete's allies become targets. And this is one of the most important developments because it changes the emotional stakes, since Machete has become responsible for people who have chosen to help him. And he cannot simply disappear when they are threatened. And his instinct to protect them demonstrates that beneath the violence, he is still motivated by loyalty. And this loyalty is also what separates him from the villains, because the criminals and corrupt politicians view people as tools, while Machete sees them as human beings. And this difference becomes increasingly clear as the story develops, and the conspirators continue treating people as disposable pieces. But Machete refuses to accept that logic, and every time someone he cares about is threatened, he becomes more determined to fight back. And the movie uses this motivation to create a classic revenge structure where every attack against the hero creates another reason for him to continue. But instead of simply increasing his anger, the attacks also strengthen the bond between him and the people resisting the conspiracy. And this turns Machete into a symbol rather than simply a lone fighter. And the more people begin supporting him, the more nervous the authorities become. Because a political campaign built around fear becomes unstable when the people being targeted start organizing against it. And this is exactly what happens because Luz and her allies begin turning anger into resistance, and Machete becomes one of the most recognizable figures in that struggle. And this creates another major conflict for Senator McLaughlin because he needs to maintain the image of control, but the situation is becoming increasingly chaotic, and every attempt to suppress the resistance risks creating more publicity, and every attempt to eliminate Machete risks exposing the conspiracy. So the people behind the campaign are trapped by their own plan. And this is a recurring theme throughout the movie because corruption often depends on secrecy, and once the truth begins escaping, the people involved must create even more lies and violence to protect the original lie. And eventually, the situation becomes impossible to control. And Machete is one of the main reasons that collapse begins happening because he refuses to disappear quietly, and as he moves closer to the people responsible, the action becomes increasingly intense, with Machete confronting armed men, escaping traps, and using his skills to survive situations where ordinary people would have no chance. And the movie's exaggerated violence continues serving both entertainment and storytelling purposes because every action sequence reveals something about Machete's character, his ability to remain calm under pressure, his willingness to take risks, and his refusal to surrender. And his fighting style also reflects his personality because it is direct and efficient rather than flashy for the sake of showing off. And even when the movie exaggerates his abilities, Machete rarely behaves as though he is trying to impress anyone. He simply does what is necessary to survive. And this makes the character strangely grounded despite the outrageous world around him. And this balance between realism and exaggeration is one of the reasons Danny Trejo's performance works so well. Because he gives Machete a sense of seriousness, while the movie itself constantly pushes the boundaries of absurdity. And as Machete's reputation grows, the conspirators realize that they need a more permanent solution. And this brings the story closer to the next stage of the conflict, where the villains begin preparing to eliminate both Machete and the people supporting him. And the political campaign becomes increasingly aggressive, using public statements and propaganda to portray the resistance as a violent threat. And this is another example of the movie's political satire, because the same people who created violence are now using that violence as evidence that their opponents are dangerous. And the audience is shown the manipulation from the inside, making it clear that the public story is completely different from the reality. And this creates a sense of frustration because the people being targeted have limited ability to defend themselves publicly. But Machete's actions begin changing that balance because he is willing to confront the people responsible directly, and the movie gradually moves toward the idea of open rebellion, where the conflict can no longer remain hidden. And this is where the supporting characters become even more important, because the resistance needs people willing to stand together, and Machete's presence gives them the confidence to do so, and Luz's leadership helps organize that resistance, while Satana's knowledge of the law helps expose the corruption from another direction. And together they begin creating a challenge that the political establishment cannot easily ignore. And Machete's personal revenge is therefore transformed into something larger, because he is no longer simply hunting his enemies. He is helping people fight back against a system that has treated them as disposable. And this transformation gives the movie its emotional center, because although Machete remains a violent character, his violence is increasingly directed toward people who use power to hurt others, and the audience is encouraged to see him as a protector despite the brutal methods he uses. And this is a classic exploitation film technique, taking a morally complicated character and placing him against villains who are so corrupt that the audience begins accepting the hero's extreme behavior as justified within the fictional world. And the movie never tries to make Machete a conventional saint. He is still capable of killing, revenge, and brutal violence, but he has a clear line that separates him from the people he fights, and that line is his willingness to protect innocent people and remain loyal to those who stand beside him. And this becomes particularly important as the story moves closer to its final confrontation, because Machete's enemies are preparing to use overwhelming force against him, and he will soon have to decide how far he is willing to go to destroy the conspiracy. And Torres's involvement adds another layer to that question, because Machete knows that his old enemy will eventually come directly into the fight, and the confrontation between them promises to be more than another action sequence. It is a reckoning with Machete's past. And this is why the movie keeps reminding the audience of the history between them, because the final conflict needs to feel personal. And as the political situation becomes more unstable, Senator McLaughlin's campaign begins approaching a critical point, and the people around him are increasingly desperate to protect his public image. And this desperation leads to more violence, more manipulation, and more attempts to silence anyone who knows the truth. And the cycle becomes increasingly difficult to stop, because every new act of violence creates another reason for Machete and his allies to fight, and every attempt to suppress them creates more resistance. And the movie's central conflict, therefore, becomes a battle over who controls the story, because the powerful people want the public to believe one version of events, while Machete and his allies know the truth. And this idea remains surprisingly relevant because political power often depends on controlling information, and the film uses its exaggerated action world to make that point dramatically. And as part 3 comes toward its conclusion, Machete is no longer hiding from the people hunting him. He is preparing to bring the fight directly to them, and the resistance around him is becoming stronger, while the conspirators are becoming more desperate. And this reversal of power is crucial, because at the beginning of the story, Machete was treated as a disposable tool. But now, the people who thought they controlled everything are forced to react to him. And the man they wanted to eliminate has become the one person capable of destroying their entire plan. And the tension is therefore rising toward an inevitable confrontation. Because Machete's past enemies, political enemies, and criminal enemies are all beginning to move toward the same battlefield. and he understands that there will soon be no way to avoid a final clash. But instead of retreating, he prepares himself because he has already decided that the only way to end the nightmare is to confront the people who created it. And with Luz and Sartana becoming important allies, with Torres waiting in the background, with Booth trying desperately to regain control, and with Senator McLaughlin's political future depending on the success of a conspiracy that is beginning to collapse, the stage is now set for the most dangerous phase of Machete's journey, where survival will no longer be enough because he must finally take the fight to the people who believed they were untouchable. And the next part will push the story into even greater violence, betrayal, and confrontation as Machete's personal war becomes an open battle against the entire network standing between him and justice. As the conspiracy begins to collapse from within, Machete Cortez finds himself at the center of a conflict that is no longer something he can escape from, because the people who tried to use him as a disposable assassin have now realized that he has become a serious threat to their entire operation, and the pressure surrounding him increases from every direction, with corrupt politicians trying to control the public narrative, criminals trying to eliminate him, and powerful men attempting to protect the secrets that could destroy them. But Machete has reached the point where fear no longer controls his decisions because he has already lost almost everything that once mattered to him, and the only thing left is his determination to finish what he started. And this is what makes the fourth part of the story so important because Machete stops reacting to the conspiracy and begins actively attacking it, turning the hunters into the hunted. And as he moves through this dangerous world, his allies become increasingly important, especially Luz and Sartana, because their involvement transforms Machete's personal mission into a broader resistance against the people exploiting political fear. And Luz understands that the community cannot continue allowing powerful figures to treat immigrants as convenient targets, while Sartana has begun seeing firsthand how deeply corruption has reached into the institutions she once trusted, and their different experiences give the resistance strength. Because Luz brings determination and connections within the community, Sartana brings knowledge of law enforcement and official procedures, and Machete brings the combat experience necessary to confront the people using violence against them. And together they become a dangerous combination for the conspirators. Because each person attacks the system from a different direction, and this is exactly what the villains did not expect, since they assumed Machete would be alone and easy to eliminate. But now he has allies who are willing to risk their own safety to help him. And this creates an emotional change in Machete as well, because the man who had spent so much of his life relying only on himself begins to understand that trust can be powerful when it is placed in the right people. And although he remains quiet and emotionally controlled, his actions show that he cares deeply about the people standing beside him. And this becomes especially important when the enemies begin targeting those allies, because every attack against them reminds Machete that the people responsible for his suffering will stop at nothing. And his response is not to retreat, but to become even more aggressive. And the movie uses this escalation to move from political thriller into full scale action, because the hidden conspiracy can no longer remain hidden. And soon the different groups involved begin preparing for open conflict, with weapons, soldiers, criminals, and political power all coming together. And Machete understands that the only way to survive is to confront the system directly. But before he can reach the people at the top, he has to fight through the network protecting them. and this creates a series of increasingly violent encounters, each one bringing him closer to the truth. And the film's action style becomes even more extreme during this section, with Rodriguez embracing the exaggerated tone that defines Machete. Because this is not meant to be a realistic military operation. It is a stylized revenge fantasy filled with impossible stunts, brutal fights, dark comedy, and characters who seem almost larger than life. And Machete's fighting style becomes a major part of the entertainment because he can transform ordinary objects into weapons, move through groups of enemies with extraordinary speed, and use his machete with an almost legendary level of skill. But underneath the spectacle, there is still a clear emotional motivation. Because every enemy he confronts represents another piece of the system that betrayed him. And every victory brings him closer to the people responsible for destroying his old life. And this makes the action feel connected to the story rather than existing only for spectacle. And one of the biggest threats remains Michael Booth, who has gone from confident businessman to increasingly desperate conspirator. Because Booth understands that Machete's survival could expose everything, and his greatest fear is not simply that Machete will kill him, but that the truth will become public and destroy the political machine he helped build. And this fear makes Booth more dangerous because he is willing to take increasingly extreme measures, and his attempts to control the situation reveal the arrogance of people who believe money and influence can solve every problem. But Machete represents the one problem that cannot be solved with money because he cannot be bought and he cannot be frightened into silence, and he has no interest in negotiating with the people who tried to destroy him. And this makes Booth's position increasingly hopeless. And while Booth struggles to maintain control, Senator John McLaughlin continues presenting himself to the public as a strong political leader. But behind the scenes, his campaign is connected to the violence and manipulation surrounding the border. And the movie deliberately uses this contradiction to criticize political fear, because McLaughlin's message depends on convincing people that immigrants are responsible for violence, while the people supporting him are actively creating violence for political benefit. And this makes his campaign one of the most important targets of Machete's resistance, because exposing the truth would destroy the narrative that gives McLaughlin his power. And Sartana's investigation becomes increasingly important because she begins connecting the evidence. And the more she learns, the clearer it becomes that the assassination attempt was designed to serve a political purpose. And this puts her in an increasingly dangerous position, because the people behind the conspiracy know that an official investigator with evidence could destroy everything they have built. And Sartana therefore becomes another target, forcing her to choose between protecting herself and continuing to uncover the truth. And she chooses the latter, demonstrating that her character has changed significantly since the beginning of the story, because she is no longer simply following the rules of the system. She is questioning those rules and challenging the people abusing them. And her relationship with Machete also becomes stronger because she understands that despite his violent methods, he is fighting against people who have corrupted the institutions around them. And this creates a complicated but effective partnership, because Machete represents direct action while Sartana represents investigation and accountability. And together they create a threat that the conspirators cannot easily neutralize. And Luz, meanwhile, continues organizing resistance and supporting the people who are being targeted by the political campaign. and her role becomes more than simply helping Machete, because she represents the larger community that the movie wants the audience to see. People who have been turned into political targets but refuse to remain silent. And this is where the movie's social message becomes strongest. Because the story suggests that fear can be used to divide communities, but solidarity can challenge that fear. And Machete becomes a symbol of that solidarity because he is willing to fight for people who may not even know him personally. And this is one of the reasons his character becomes more heroic as the story develops. Because his motivations gradually expand beyond revenge. And although he still wants to confront the people responsible for his personal suffering, he also understands that his fight can protect others from experiencing the same kind of betrayal and violence. And this gives the story a larger emotional purpose. And as the resistance grows, the people in power become increasingly aggressive, and the conflict begins spreading beyond individual confrontations, creating the feeling that a major battle is approaching. And this is exactly what the movie has been building toward, because the separate storylines involving Machete, Luz, Sartana, Booth, McLaughlin, and Torres are now moving closer together, and the audience begins to understand that the final confrontation will involve not just one villain but several different forms of power: political, criminal, financial, and institutional, and Machete must navigate all of them. And this is where Torres becomes particularly important because his relationship with Machete is one of the oldest conflicts in the story. And unlike Booth, Torres does not underestimate Machete because he knows exactly what Machete is capable of. And this gives their eventual confrontation a different energy because Torres is not simply another man hired to kill Machete. He is part of Machete's history, and their conflict represents the past returning to demand a final reckoning. And Torres's calm confidence contrasts sharply with Machete's silent determination, creating a confrontation that feels inevitable. And as Machete continues moving forward, he is forced to confront not only external enemies but also his own memories. Because the violence surrounding him reminds him of the life he once had. And although the movie does not spend a huge amount of time exploring his emotional pain through dialogue, Danny Trejo communicates much of it through his expression and physical presence. Because Machete often appears emotionally exhausted, even when he is physically unstoppable. And this creates an interesting contradiction, because the character can defeat multiple enemies in a fight but still carries emotional wounds that no weapon can repair. And this is why his relationship with the people around him matters, because they remind him that he still has something worth protecting. And this gives him a reason to keep going beyond simple revenge. And as the conflict intensifies, the conspirators begin using the media and political machinery to shape public perception. And the movie shows how easily people can be manipulated when they are frightened, because the public is not given the full story. Instead, they are presented with carefully constructed images of danger and violence, and this allows politicians to justify stronger policies and more aggressive enforcement, while the people actually creating the violence remain hidden. And this political manipulation is one of the most serious elements of the film, because beneath the blood and exaggerated action is an argument about how fear can become a weapon. And Machete's fight therefore becomes a battle for truth as much as a battle for survival. And the movie makes this point through extreme examples, but the underlying idea remains clear. When people are frightened, they may accept explanations that they would question under normal circumstances. And powerful individuals can exploit that fear to increase their control. And Machete's survival threatens this entire strategy because he knows what actually happened and he is willing to expose it. And as the story moves closer to the final act, the resistance prepares for a direct confrontation. And Machete knows that there will be casualties because the enemy is too powerful to defeat without risk. But he also knows that continuing to run will only allow the conspiracy to grow stronger. And this creates one of the most important decisions of his journey because he must choose whether to protect himself or take the greater risk of confronting the people responsible. And as expected, he chooses confrontation. Because Machete has never been motivated by personal safety, and this is what separates him from the villains who are constantly protecting themselves through other people's suffering, while Machete is willing to put himself in danger to protect others. And this moral contrast becomes increasingly clear and as the final preparations begin, the characters on both sides understand that the next confrontation could determine everything. Because if Machete succeeds, the conspiracy could collapse. But if he fails, the people behind it could gain even more power. And the stakes are therefore much higher than they were at the beginning. And the movie responds to this by increasing the scale of its action, moving toward larger fights and more dramatic confrontations. And the supporting characters become increasingly involved because the final battle cannot be won by one person alone. And this reinforces the theme of teamwork that has been developing throughout the story. Because Machete may be the central hero, but his success depends on people who are willing to stand with him. And Luz and Sartana both demonstrate that courage does not belong only to soldiers or professional fighters, because ordinary people can become heroes when they decide to resist injustice. And this is an important part of the movie's message. And as the enemy prepares to strike, Machete's reputation has grown so much that he is no longer simply a target. He has become a symbol that the villains cannot easily destroy. Because even if they kill him, the people who have been inspired by his resistance may continue fighting. And this is one of the reasons the political establishment becomes increasingly desperate. Because symbols are harder to eliminate than individuals. And the more they try to silence Machete, the more attention they draw to him. And the movie turns this into an ironic situation where the conspirators are helping create the legend they fear. And Machete himself remains largely unaware of the symbolic role he is playing because he is focused on the immediate mission. But the audience can see the larger meaning developing around him. And as the final confrontation approaches, the story also begins bringing Torres closer to Machete, and their eventual meeting promises to resolve the personal conflict that has existed beneath the political storyline. And Torres's presence also reminds Machete that his past cannot simply be forgotten, because the criminal world that once controlled his life has returned and he must finally decide how to deal with it. And this gives the final act a personal dimension that complements the larger political conflict. And while the conspirators prepare their forces, Machete prepares himself in the only way he knows how, by accepting the danger and moving forward. And this is where the character's philosophy becomes clear, because he does not believe that fear can be defeated by hiding from it. He believes that the only way to overcome powerful enemies is to confront them directly. And this philosophy drives him into the final battle. And the movie continues balancing serious themes with exaggerated humor. Because even as the situation becomes more dangerous, Rodriguez refuses to abandon the playful tone that defines the film. And this mixture is part of what makes Machete unique, because it can move from political commentary to absurd violence to dark comedy within the same sequence. And the audience is expected to understand that the movie is intentionally exaggerated. And this awareness allows the film to say things that a more serious thriller might struggle to communicate. Because the outrageous style gives Rodriguez freedom to push political ideas to their extreme. And by this stage, the audience understands exactly what the movie is doing. It is taking the classic revenge hero, placing him inside a political conspiracy, and using his violence as a form of exaggerated resistance against corruption. And Machete's journey, therefore, becomes both an action adventure and a satire. And as part 4 approaches its conclusion, the balance of power has changed dramatically from the beginning. Because at first, Machete was being hunted by people who believed they controlled everything. But now the conspirators are the ones preparing defensively because they know Machete is coming. And this reversal is the payoff for everything that has happened so far. And the people who thought they could manipulate him are now forced to confront the consequences of their own decisions. And Machete is ready to give them exactly what they feared, a fight they cannot control. And with the resistance gathering, Sartana uncovering more evidence, Luz preparing for the larger struggle, Booth desperately trying to protect himself, Senator McLaughlin attempting to maintain his political image, and Torres waiting for his inevitable confrontation with Machete. The story is now positioned for its final and most explosive phase, because all the separate conflicts are about to collide. And Machete understands that there will be no turning back once the final battle begins. But he is no longer interested in escaping, because he has reached the point where justice and revenge have become impossible to separate. And the people who destroyed his past have created a situation in which he must fight